Well, this is one of those stories when Lauren tells the girls, what would Jesus do, that we should remember this one. Because I've always loved that. People say, well, you need to act like Jesus. You need to be like Jesus. Well, remember that table turning is within the realm of possibilities. Table turning, driving sheep, oxen out of the temple with a homemade cord. I thought that was really interesting. One commentary brought that up as it was a homemade cord. It wasn't like something he had handy with him. He just kind of made this up, maybe perhaps out of some rope that was laying around to drive them out, or a stick or something, to change the ethos of the culture of the temple. It was fairly common. It was common practice in the day that you could go to the temple to make the sacrifices, and people would be there selling these pigeons and doves and calves and things that were required for the Jewish rites of purification and altar gifts, penitence. And Jesus goes in and upsets the apple cart in a big way. Now, in the other Gospels, this is one of those stories that's in all four of the Gospels, so that gives it some credence and remembrances, but it also reminds us of the importance of it. But in the other Gospels, in the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this is one of those stories at the end. After Jesus has preached and taught and been around places and in the world, this kind of is part of the culmination. And then because of this, those in religious authorities realize that he's too dangerous to continue on. But in John, there's a difference. Jesus has barely completed his first miracle, turning water into the wine at the wedding in Cana. And then he goes into the temple and he begins to upset the full economy of the temple. Man, what a way to make an entrance. You know, it's just not what you want. It's like you invite a neighbor over. Whenever we could invite neighbors over, or one of these days when we can invite neighbors over, they show up to visit you for a cup of coffee and a piece of cake, and they bring an entire construction team to redo your house. You can imagine how you would feel like that. Like, what? What's going on? This is what I know. This is my stuff. Don't mess with it. And yet that's not what's happening here. Jesus is going in and changing the whole system. Lent oftentimes, it seems to me, gets to turn into this kind of personal time, which is good, and I'm not going to knock that and not going to encourage you not to do that. But it's also not just about us as individuals. This story reminds us that part of the Lenten journey, part of the Lenten story is a story about our world and our view of the world around us. What we've become used to and what we've become accustomed to, what's become our practice and our patterns, sometimes might need just a little bit of reevaluation. And as we sit in this beautiful part of the sanctuary, or perhaps you remember this place, sitting at home, we look around and we can see a beautiful temple. I love it. With the way the sun comes through the stained glass windows, you just can't mimic that every day. Yet, it's kind of one of those things that is a constant. Well, there's some days it's just a constant aggravation, this place. Especially with all this rain and water. We can't keep it out of the walls. We can't keep it off the roofs. We can't. And it's, did any of you remember the movie The Money Pit? Well, they tried to build their house. The old version of that was Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream Home. If you want to see a really old classic movie. And they keep on, and everything changes, and everything it just keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Sometimes that's the way it seems around here. And so it requires some resources. I mean, we just redid the front doors that some of you have been able to see today. I mean, it's the first time in, I don't know, I'm thinking maybe 60 years that it's been done. So, I mean, we're in for the long haul. But it provides a place for us to gather, generally in larger groups without masks. But right now, because of necessity, for this year, which we now approach, we're here in a different form, in a different way. Not quite as opening and welcoming as we normally would be. But we're trying to do it safely to keep everybody safe. And yet, there's a place and time in which we gather to be able to worship. It's not that this becomes our idolism or this becomes our pure devotion as this building or this temple. But this provides an opportunity, a place for us to gather so that we can worship God together. I always loved Niebuhr's, and I can't remember which one it is offhand. I'm a really bad theological scholar, researcher this week. But he always talked about the idea of misplaced loyalties. When the loyalty that what we should be focused on of God becomes something else. And I remember my theology professor who constantly drank from a styrofoam cup, held it up and said, this coffee cup can become your focus, your center. That's not what it should be. When it becomes, our systems become those things which are our loyalties, there's time for reevaluation. When even our processes of our governments and leadership become the loyalties, there becomes a challenge. Where do we place our loyalty? Where do we place our devotion? I think that's one of those things that makes it a little bit more complicated because Jesus brings in the whole idea of the temple. This temple you can destroy in 3 days and I will rise it up. It'll be destroyed and in 3 days I'll raise it up. You know, for us humans, those who are expected, those who just follow along in life's norms, we think, what? I mean, we're just like the religious leaders of the day. We're like, you could destroy this temple and then we can build it back in 3 days. It took 46 years. Jesus isn't talking about a structure, a commonality. Jesus is referring to this himself. It's the Christ. You can lay down his life, as John says, but he'll take it back up. The resurrected Christ. Some scholars suggest that this story probably did happen on into the ministry, more like what Matthew, Mark, and Luke say. But for John, part of what John wants us to know early on is the power of Jesus at work. To see this in a change and a trajectory of what's going to happen. This is where oftentimes we get the idea of Jesus' 3 years of ministry. This is a Passover story. And this is the first one in John. There are 2 others. So there's where we began to take Jesus' ministry lasted 3 years. There's an old story and an old saying that oftentimes is talked about, especially whenever the preaching courses are talked about, prophetic preaching. And the classic line that always is said for a prophet is, one who speaks truth to power is a prophet. Oh, we've heard examples of that, and we've seen some of those things. I went once to a service of installation for a pastor friend, and in that, the preacher for the day often changed something in my brain on this story. To speak truth to power. He said, people already know the truth deep within them. People need to be reminded of the truth that resides. There's a lot of us that know our conscience and our guide and our walk with Christ and what it calls us to do and who it calls us to be. And somehow in the busyness of the world, we get distracted. We begin to look with the same eyes that the world looks. And we miss the point of what it means to be people of faith. Perhaps what these temples represent, and this church is one, this front facade is so beautiful. I never understood why it was so close to the street until I began to put together the pieces of how it was built. And then it never really made sense to me why this church, don't tell West Market Street, but this is a prettier building. And somehow it began to make sense when I learned that at one point, originally, this Walker Avenue went straight through campus. And Walker Avenue was the main road to Winston-Salem and High Point from Greensboro, from downtown. Well, that went on for a while, and they decided to make some improvements. And guess which street was the main road from Greensboro to Winston and High Point? Spring Garden. Long about 1918, 1919, that period. So for us to build this kind of edifice on the front of the main drag headed to Winston-Salem, High Point from downtown Greensboro headed to Greensboro, was a huge visible reminder of, one, the Methodist congregation, and two, the visible presence of God wafting into the world. Oh, stately introduction. Perhaps that was the image they were trying to convey, is not just this grandiose building, but the power of God. And we can't really do that. You've heard me say this. One of my professors, I love him to death, he used to say that the old line that Baptists could worship Jesus as good in a barn as they could a cathedral was true. But he said a cathedral sure does help. It begins to awingness of God, of realizing the greatness and the vastness of God, of who God is. And even our grandiose buildings are only small attempts to represent to the world the vastness of God, the awing. Part of the reason cathedrals are built as they are is you walk in and you're like, just kind of takes you away. It sends to the world in a way the world can imagine and understand of the greatness of God, that our words and our lives are limited to fully express to others. But part of what Lent does, part of what Lent is a time to understand the interaction with God and the world, and how, regardless of how askew and messed up it is, that there's an inbreaking continuing of the Holy Spirit in the world. And we need not forget that. We need not fail to look for that. That the goodness of God that resides within us, resides within our world, is still at work. Is still making its presence known. Is still transforming our lives and our world. Despite the corruption we see, despite the injustices that we see, that we're called, and perhaps this Lent reminds us that we too are sometimes table turners. Now, I'm not recommending physically doing that right now. I don't want to, But sometimes we've got to get a little bit noisy, as they say. We've got to change things, make awareness of it. One commentator puts it like this, that kind of sums it up for me. This story is a story of conflict of values, a conflict between what Jesus Christ really means and those values espoused by the structures of religion with which Jesus contended. He didn't just let things continue on the way they were. Continue to make a difference and change the world. And we continue to be called into that journey, into that path. That this is our journey too, as people of Christ in the world. All glory, honor, and power be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.